Oh. The word fell out of Reginald Ashby's mouth the way a man drops something he considers worthless, without looking, without caring where it lands. He was standing at the head of the conference table on the 42nd floor of the Ashby Financial Tower in downtown Toronto, and he was looking at the door, not at the young woman who had just walked through it. 12 men in dark suits were watching him, the way dogs watch their owner. Nobody looked at her either. Her name was Daphne Osei-Bonsu. She was 26 years old. She had a master's degree in forensic accounting from the University of Waterloo, and she had taken 2 buses and a subway to get here because her car had broken down on the Gardiner the week before, and she hadn't had the money to fix it yet. She was holding a folder. The folder had 47 pages in it. She had printed them at a Staples on Yonge Street because the printer at her apartment building had been broken since February. Reginald Ashby still hadn't looked at her. "I said no visitors," he told someone. His assistant probably, a thin man hovering near the door. "I don't know who let her in." "Mr. Ashby." Daphne's voice was steady. That was the thing about her. And the people who underestimated her always found this out too late. She did not rattle easily. Her grandmother, Beatrice Osei-Bonsu, had raised her on a small dairy farm outside of Orangeville, Ontario. And Beatrice had a saying she repeated every morning while doing chores: "You carry yourself like what you are, and what you are is enough." Daphne had heard it so many times that it had become something like a bone inside her, structural, load-bearing. "Mr. Ashby," she said again, "my name is Daphne Osei-Bonsu. I'm with the audit review team your board commissioned in January. I've been working this file for 11 weeks, and I believe I've found something you need to see before Monday." That was when Reginald Ashby finally looked at her. He was 64 years old. He had silver hair that cost him $400 a month to maintain, a Patek Philippe on his left wrist, and the particular kind of confidence that grows in men who have never once been told they were wrong by anyone who mattered. He looked at Daphne the way you look at something you just found on the bottom of your shoe. "Did your father work in finance?" he asked. The question landed in the room like something thrown. A few of the men around the table shifted. One of them, a younger one near the window, maybe 30, with a loosened tie, looked down at his phone. Nobody said anything. Daphne didn't blink. "My father was a mechanical engineer," she said. "My mother was a nurse, my grandmother raised cattle, and I'm the one who found the discrepancy in your Q3 reporting." Reginald smiled. It was a particular kind of smile, the kind that isn't warm, the kind that is meant to make the other person feel small. "We have 12 senior analysts on this file," he said. "People who've been in this building longer than you've been alive. Are you telling me a junior auditor from—" he glanced at the folder she was holding. "Waterloo?" "The University of Waterloo," she said. "Found something 12 professionals mess?" "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." The room was very quiet. Reginald Ashby sat back in his chair and crossed his arms. He looked at the 12 men, and then he looked back at her, and he said, "You have 5 minutes. After that, security will escort you out." He said it the way people say things they're certain of. He was about to find out what certainty costs you when it's wrong. What nobody in that room knew, what nobody ever knew, because Daphne was not someone who led with her story, was that she had been looking at this file since November. Not because she was assigned to it in November. She wasn't assigned until January, when the board quietly commissioned an independent review after 2 institutional investors started asking uncomfortable questions about the Ashby Group's reported returns. But Daphne had seen something in November, in a set of quarterly filings she was reviewing for a completely different client, and something about the numbers had caught at her the way a splinter catches at skin. A small thing, barely visible. Most people would have moved on. She hadn't moved on. She had started a spreadsheet on her personal laptop. She labeled it personal notes, and she did not tell her supervisor, and she did not tell her colleagues. She worked on it in the evenings after dinner, sitting at the kitchen table in her apartment in Scarborough with a cup of her grandmother's tea, the kind Beatrice used to make with dried ginger and a piece of cinnamon bark steeping in a mug beside her. She worked on it because she couldn't not work on it, because the numbers didn't add up, and that bothered her the way an off-key note bothers someone with perfect pitch. By December, she had 17 pages of notes. By January, when she was formally assigned to the audit, she had 31. The thing she had found, and this took her weeks to understand, because it had been buried with real artistry, the kind of deliberate artistry that takes effort and planning, was a pattern of deferred recognition. Revenue that existed was being recorded late. Not fraudulently late, technically. There was a shelf of regulatory gray area that made it, on its face, defensible, but when you mapped the timing against the quarterly investor communications, when you put the two things side by side and looked at them together, you saw that the delay was not random. It was systematic. It always moved in one direction, and it always benefited the same set of transactions. 11 weeks later, she had 47 pages. She had also, 3 days ago, sent a secure summary to the board's independent counsel, just in case. That was the thing people forgot about Daphne Osei-Bonsu. She was quiet, she was careful, but she was not passive. She had learned from Beatrice that quiet and passive are not the same thing at all. Reginald was looking at his watch. "You've had 2 of your 5 minutes," he said. "I'd start talking if I were you." Daphne set the folder on the table. She didn't ask for permission. She opened it to page 3, not page 1, which was the summary, but page 3, which was the chart, and she turned it so it faced Reginald. "This is your Q3 revenue recognition timeline mapped against your investor call dates," she said. "The highlighted entries, 12 of them over 4 quarters, show revenue that was confirmed internally in the month prior but recorded in the following quarter." "That's within standard practice," said one of the men at the table. His name was Stuart Fenwick, and he was the group's chief financial officer, and he had been in his job for 19 years. He said it firmly, the way people speak when they want the firmness itself to be the argument. "On its own, yes," Daphne said. She didn't look at Stuart. She kept her eyes on Reginald, but not in context. She turned to page 9. "This is the correlation between the deferred entries and the language used in your quarterly communications to investors. Specifically, the phrasing around pipeline confidence and anticipated close timelines," she pointed. "Every single time revenue was deferred, the investor communication in that quarter used language that suggested the pipeline was softer than it actually was internally." Nobody moved. "That's a pattern," she said. "Taken together, it tells a consistent story about the timing of information reaching investors versus the timing of information you held internally." Stuart Fenwick opened his mouth. "I've already sent a summary to your board counsel," Daphne said, before he could speak. 3 days ago. So this conversation is on record, regardless of what happens in the next 3 minutes." The room was absolutely still. Reginald Ashby's face had changed. The smile was gone. Something else was there now. Something harder to name. She had seen it before, in other rooms on other faces. It was the look of a man recalculating. "You can throw me out," Daphne said, "or you can tell me what you want to do next." She closed the folder and waited. Outside the window, Toronto was doing what Toronto does in early March, a weak sun trying its best over the gray lake, a few last crusts of snow on the edge of the plaza, 42 floors below. A courier was locking up his bike at the rack by the lobby. An elderly woman was walking a very small dog very slowly. The ordinary city, indifferent to what was happening above it. Inside the conference room, Reginald Ashby looked at Stuart Fenwick. Stuart Fenwick looked at the folder. The 12 men at the table did not look at anything in particular. Reginald looked back at Daphne. "How long?" he said. Not a question, exactly, more like a man feeling around in the dark for something solid. "Have you been looking at this file?" "Since November," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. "That was before you were assigned." Yes. He looked at the folder again. Then he picked it up. He opened it to page 3, the chart, and he studied it the way he probably studied most things, with the assumption that he would find the flaw in it, the error, the place where it fell apart under pressure. It didn't fall apart. She had made sure of that. Page 12, she said quietly. The footnotes on page 12 cross-referenced the specific entries against the board minutes from each corresponding quarter. The board minutes are your own documentation. He turned to page 12. Stuart Fenwick had gone very still. Reginald read. He read for longer than anyone expected. The room stayed quiet. A phone buzzed somewhere and was silenced immediately. Outside, a cloud moved across the sun and the room dimmed slightly, then brightened again. When Reginald put the folder down, something in the set of his shoulders was different, not broken, not contrite, but different. "What do you recommend?" he asked. It was such a simple question, but to Daphne, who had taken 2 buses and the subway to get here, who had printed 47 pages at a Staples on Yonge Street, who had spent 11 weeks working evenings at a kitchen table in Scarborough with a cup of ginger tea, it landed somewhere significant. Not triumphant, not vindicated, something quieter than that. Something that felt like being seen. "Voluntary disclosure," she said. "Before the OSC comes to you, cooperate fully with the restatement. The timing and the intent are going to be read charitably if you get ahead of it. They won't be if you don't." She said it calmly, as if she were talking about something ordinary. The weather. Transit delays. The kind of thing Canadians discuss in elevators without drama. Reginald Ashby nodded once, slowly. "We'll need to talk to counsel," Stuart Fenwick said, and his voice was different now too. The firmness was gone. What was left was just a man in a room, figuring out what came next. "Of course," Daphne said. "I'll be available." She took the elevator down, alone. On the 37th floor, a man got on, mid-50s, expensive coat, briefcase, the kind of man who had spent his whole life in rooms like the one she'd just left. He glanced at her once and then looked at his phone. She had seen this exact glance 10,000 times. The half-second assessment, the quiet conclusion, the looking away. She thought about her grandmother. Beatrice Osei-Bonsu had come to Canada from Ghana in 1974. She had arrived in Toronto in January, which, she always said, was the cruelest possible month to arrive in Canada, if you were from a country where January felt like something warm and living. She had worn a coat that wasn't warm enough, and shoes that were not made for ice, and she had carried 1 suitcase and the address of a cousin's cousin written on a piece of paper. She had eventually made her way to Orangeville, and she had eventually, over many years of stubborn, careful work, come to own 11 acres and a modest herd of Holstein cattle. She had raised 3 children. She had buried 1 husband and later one of those children, Daphne's mother, who died when Daphne was 9, of a cancer that moved fast. Beatrice had kept going. That was the other thing she always said, though she said it less like a lesson and more like a statement of fact. You keep going. You don't stop because someone tells you to stop. You stop when the work is done. The elevator reached the lobby. The man with the briefcase walked out without looking back. Daphne walked out into the cold March air and stood for a moment on the plaza. She could see the courier who had been locking his bike earlier, now pushing off down Bay Street. She could see the woman with the small dog, now sitting on a bench, her face tipped up toward the thin sun. She put her bag over her shoulder and started toward the subway. The call came 6 days later, on a Tuesday morning. She was at her desk eating a container of leftover jollof rice, the kind her grandmother had taught her to make, with tomatoes from a can, because it was March and no one had real tomatoes in March in Ontario, when her phone rang. It was an area code she recognized, the board's counsel. They had decided to proceed with voluntary disclosure. They were restating the Q3 and Q4 filings. They were acknowledging the pattern she had identified. They wanted to formally retain her as a consulting expert through the restatement process. She thanked him. She said she would send over her rates. She ate the rest of her jollof rice. Then she called her grandmother. Beatrice answered on the second ring, which meant she was inside. If she was out with the cattle, she never heard the phone. Daphne, she said, the way she always said it, like a sentence in itself. Grandma, Daphne said, I want to tell you something. She told her. Not the regulatory details, not the forensic accounting mechanics, just the shape of what had happened. She had found something nobody expected her to find. She had gone into a room full of people who didn't want to hear it, and they had listened. Beatrice was quiet for a moment after she finished. Did they apologize? She asked. Daphne laughed. It surprised her. The laugh came out unexpectedly, real and warm. No, Grandma, not exactly. Beatrice said. Well, they will think about it. People like that always think about it later, when the room is quiet and there's nobody watching. She paused. Are you reading? I'm eating right now. Good. Come this weekend. I'll make something. What happened after that unfolded the way these things do, slowly, thoroughly, in the language of regulatory filings and board minutes and carefully worded press statements. The Ashby Group restated 2 quarters of earnings. The Ontario Securities Commission reviewed and accepted the voluntary disclosure. The investigation that followed was, by all accounts, conducted cooperatively. Stuart Fenwick retired early. 3 other senior executives took on restructured roles. Reginald Ashby remained as chairman, though with significantly reduced operational authority. He gave a statement to the financial press that was measured and institutional, the kind of statement that reveals very little and acknowledges just enough. He did not mention Daphne. She hadn't expected him to. But 3 weeks after the restatement was filed, she received a letter, paper, not email, her name and address written by hand on the outside. The handwriting was the deliberate kind of old-fashioned handwriting that belongs to men of a certain generation and a certain education, the kind who were taught that your penmanship said something about your character. Inside was a single page, no letterhead. It read, Miss Osei-Bonsu, the work you did was correct. I was wrong to receive it the way I did. I wanted you to know that I know that. They was signed R. Ashby. Daphne read it twice. She put it on her kitchen table. She made a cup of tea, ginger, cinnamon bark, the way Beatrice had taught her, and she sat with it for a while. Then she put the letter in a drawer and went back to work. There were other files. There were always other files. Somewhere right now. In some spreadsheet on some server in some building she hadn't walked into yet, there was a pattern that didn't add up, a timing that was off, a story hiding in numbers that everyone else had walked past without noticing. She was the one who noticed. That had always been true. It would go on being true. The following spring, Beatrice Osei-Bonsu was invited to speak at a small community event in Orangeville, a celebration of local women in agriculture, the kind of event that doesn't make the news but matters to the people in the room. Daphne drove up from Scarborough on a Saturday morning, the highway opening up past Brampton into the flat green fields she had grown up looking at. Beatrice stood at a modest podium in the back room of a community center that smelled like coffee and folding chairs, and said, among other things, that the most important thing she had ever taught anyone was not how to run a farm or manage cattle or get through a Canadian winter. The most important thing, she said, is to know what you know, and to walk into any room carrying it. Afterward, at the table with the coffee urns and the butter tarts, a woman came up to Daphne, maybe 40, dark blazer, a kind of focused energy about her, and said, Are you the daughter, the accountant? Granddaughter, Daphne said. The woman shook her head. She talks about you all the time. And then, quietly, seriously, the way someone says something true, she is so proud of you. Daphne looked across the room at Beatrice, who was standing with a group of women her age, laughing at something, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee, completely at home in herself. She thought about a Tuesday morning in a conference room on the 42nd floor. She thought about 12 men who didn't look at her. She thought about 47 pages printed at a Staples on Yonge Street. She thought, the world has a long habit of not seeing certain people, but the work sees them. The work always tells the truth. And she thought about all the young women somewhere right now, sitting at kitchen tables, working on spreadsheets with dried ginger tea going cold beside them, finding the thing nobody told them to find, building the case nobody told them to build. And she hoped they knew what she was only beginning, fully, to understand. You don't need the room to see you first. You just need to walk in. I keep thinking about the moment Daphne set that folder on the table. Not dramatically, not with a speech. She just placed it down and opened it to page 3, the way someone does when they've done the work and they know it. That's the thing nobody talks about when they tell stories like this one. Everyone focuses on the room, the 12 men, the 42nd floor, the man who asked if her father had taught her anything worth knowing. And yes, that moment matters. But what matters more, to me, is the 11 weeks before it. The kitchen table in Scarborough, the spreadsheet she started in November before anyone asked her to, the ginger tea going cold while she mapped one more quarter, cross-referenced one more board minute, checked one more thing that didn't have to be her responsibility, but became it anyway because she couldn't walk past something that wasn't right. That's what I think about when I think about integrity, not the big dramatic stands, the small private ones, the ones nobody sees. Daphne didn't start that file because she thought it would lead somewhere. She started it because the numbers were off, and that bothered her. And she was the kind of person who doesn't leave things that bother her alone. That's a moral choice, even when it doesn't look like one, especially then. And then there's what she actually did with 11 weeks of evenings. The depth of it, the patience of it. 47 pages. Footnotes cross-referencing board minutes. A correlation analysis between deferred revenue entries and investor call language. She didn't just find the thing. She built the case around it so carefully that when Reginald Ashby turned to page 12, there was nothing to argue with. The documentation was his own. She had used his own words to tell the truth about his own company. That kind of thinking, that disciplined, methodical, unshowy intelligence is something you build over years. It comes from caring about the work more than you care about being noticed for it. Which brings me to Beatrice, because you can't tell Daphne's story without her. The woman who came to Canada in January 1974 with one suitcase and the wrong shoes for ice. Who built 11 acres and a cattle herd through decades of stubborn, careful work. Who buried a husband and a child and kept going, not because she was unfeeling, but because she had decided, somewhere deep in herself, that stopping wasn't something she was willing to do. That kind of endurance, the quiet, daily kind, not the cinematic kind, is what gets passed down, not in speeches, in how you show up at the kitchen table the next morning. Reginald's letter, when it came, said, "I was wrong to receive it the way I did." He didn't have to write that. Nobody would have made him. And I think there's something true in the fact that it came on paper, by hand, addressed to her specifically. The world sometimes comes around. Not always, not fast enough. But sometimes, in a quiet room with nobody watching, a person looks at what actually happened and tells the truth about it. What I take from Daphne's story is this: the work is the argument, not the volume of your voice in the room, not the credential on the wall. The actual work, done carefully, done honestly, done even when no one asked you to and no one was watching, is what holds up under pressure. You carry yourself like what you are, Beatrice said, and what you are is enough. I believe that. I think Daphne proves it.